The last presentation, Sound Public Policy During the COVID Pandemic, will be presented by Stefan Bartulica from Croatia on behalf of the Center for Renewal of Culture.
Okay. So how much time do I have, Elizabeth?
Around 15 minutes.
Okay.
18 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. Know.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today, and I want to thank the Austrian Economics Center for their kind invitation. I just heard from a colleague here at the central bank that this beautiful building was destroyed in a fire in 1979. It was shocking to hear that. The entire building burnt to the ground and was later restored about 40 years ago. So it's a pleasure to be here. I have been cooperating with Barbara Kolm for many years, hosting the Croatian leg of the Free Market Roadshow. But I will speak more as a member of Parliament today. I represent a new conservative party in the Parliament of Croatia. And I want to make a few remarks regarding the pandemic and everything that's happened around the world and in Europe since early spring of 2020. Our government in Croatia, I can say in a positive light, resisted severe lockdowns. There was tremendous pressure at the time last year when the numbers were rising to impose a complete lockdown. And many countries in Europe had done this. And there was widespread disagreement among experts who were advising the government on what to do. So there wasn't a consensus, not even close. And looking back now, we're obviously still in the pandemic. People are wearing masks, children even. I have mentioned many times during parliamentary debates that the prevailing opinions of the day have shifted quite significantly. So at one point we were hearing that masks don't work, that there's no point in wearing them. That was repeated many times during last year. And now that opinion has moved to the situation where today we have children being required to wear masks in elementary school, etc. So we see a significant change as time goes on. And science, of course, is a work in progress. Different theories are tested, different approaches to reality are tested with different results. And then as we accumulate data and information, we adapt. But the problem I see is wider, and it's this new normal or this new situation where I think fundamental human rights and freedoms are under threat. And we shouldn't give them up so easily. So history shows that once citizens give up certain rights, rarely do they receive them back. Do we receive them again? Governments tend to hold power that they accumulate through various means. And so in this time of the corona pandemic, I will say it's important to know I had the virus. I contracted it last year, so I was at home for about 10 days, sick. It wasn't pleasant, but luckily I survived. I didn't have to be hospitalized. So I do understand that it's a reality and it's a serious disease, especially for people who are not in general good health. I know personally also people who were quite healthy before they got the virus and they didn't survive. There's cases like that of people I know personally. But I do want to say that as a society, as a sane society that wants to, I think, maintain some kind of, how would I say, hierarchy of priorities. We live in a time where the media, with the daily news of, the numbers and the situation in hospitals, and so it has created a kind of atmosphere of general fear and even panic for some people, which is certainly not healthy. But the underlying truth that I want to stress is that it's a fact of life that we will all die. We will all die, whether we like it or not. That fate will await us all. And people have always died from various causes. That's something that we have to keep in mind. There's nothing exists such as a risk-free existence. So how do we apply these basic principles, or let's say the virtue of prudence, to this particular case? Because if you use the analogy, for example, of traffic, there's many tragic accidents that happen on a daily basis in cities around the world. And there's always a risk of being killed even once you turn on your car ignition and drive to a certain destination. I came last night from Zagreb. It was quite wet and rainy, dark. There's always a risk that something bad might happen. That's the reality of human existence. But no one would dare make the argument that we have to, in a new way, regulate or restrict movement of people because bad things are happening in traffic. That's not on the table. That's not on the agenda. Even though we see in the news the consequences of awful things that happen on a daily basis. Of course, airline crashes are the most dramatic. So how do we keep, our sanity and a proper view about what's happening around us? Well, I repeat oftentimes that despite the changes that we're seeing with the new variants of the virus, the Delta variant, and then there's new variants popping up, the mortality rate is still extremely low for the general population. It's extremely low. So the basic question we must ask is whether all these measures are justified for a disease with such a low mortality rate. Are some of the things that the governments have imposed, like closing down businesses for months, are these measures justified under the circumstances? If we have some historical perspective, we know that in the past, certain diseases in Europe wiped out up to a third of the population, a third. So I would argue in those cases, it's not exaggerated to say that governments had to impose severe measures to protect public health. But in this day and age, I would say we are observing exaggerated reactions to this disease. That's my view. And it's not easy to make these arguments in the public because the media tends to put you in a category where you're either denying something that is very dangerous, or if you insist that vaccination must remain something of your free choice, then you're labeled an anti-vaxxer or someone who doesn't believe in science, and you tend to receive harsh treatment in the media. So it takes, I would say, courage to speak clearly and in a commonsensical way about what's happening, because no one has, the perfect solution, I would say. No one has the perfect solution. So when I say my body, my choice, as we hear oftentimes in the abortion debate, where I don't think this logic applies, my body, my choice, because there's two bodies in the equation. For vaccines, I do think it makes very good sense to say my body, my choice. But the left, especially the political left, rejects this. So I've received very hostile reactions in the parliament when I say out loud concerning vaccines. I believe that the main principle is my body, my choice, and that people should not be forced or threatened to, if they do not get vaccinated, to lose their job, etc. I think this is not prudent, in my opinion. I think it leads down a slippery path, a very slippery path, and that we must, as a society, draw these lines very clearly and not allow governments to trample them. So Croatia has, I would say, compared to other countries in Europe, fared relatively well. The main problem in Croatia is that we have a very dysfunctional health system that's still run by the government. It's a socialist approach, and it hasn't been reformed since the early 90s. And so we have, unfortunately, medical doctors, in our case, a neurosurgeon who's the Minister of Health, making more or less economic decisions. How to spend scarce resources during this pandemic, where to put, where to spend money, etc. There's, I think, a great danger, and we will know the figures next year, but I think there's a great danger that people suffering from much more serious diseases like cancer or heart disease, the numbers of deaths being caused by these diseases will rise significantly in countries like Croatia because they haven't been treated adequately, because too much attention has been given to this pandemic. It's not an easy subject, but I just wanted to provide some remarks, I think commonsensical remarks, that we must always be very vigilant. We must raise our voices when we see that governments are overreaching and overstepping their natural authority. So there is obviously a role for government in maintaining public health. The question is, what is the prudent way to achieve this? And I think we have to be very, very careful and cautious today, especially when we look at children. We will just see years from now the long-term implications of this new normal, wearing masks, this separation of people, isolation. I've met some priests, parish priests, who tell me that they just have people wander into their office because they haven't had anyone to speak to for months. So what are the implications of all this for a society? How do we remain a healthy and even sane society under these new circumstances? So I think there is a role for our movement. I classify myself as a conservative, as a classical liberal on economics and a social conservative, but I think we together with our libertarian friends need to form alliances to fight back against government abuse of power that's happening around us. So that's what I wanted to provide, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
So, questions?
Well, thank you for this. Is that okay? Thank you for this talk. Well, I very much sympathize with your view, of course, but I'm not sure whether your argument is really sound. especially your comparison with traffic. I think the comparison would be valid if every traffic disaster, if every how you say, of every Unfall, how you say in English? Accident. Thank you. If every accident would cause 2 other accidents, so that you had an exponential increase in accidents by every accident. That's what happens with the virus. But that's in no way the case with traffic accidents. It's just the opposite the case, that if you hear about an accident, you drive more carefully. Then the law comes in. You have the safety belt, you have speed limitations. So there have been interventions to make traffic safer. And so I think the comparison simply does not hold. So we had really a problem, and I think it's even in Croatia, you had some lockdowns, some partial measures, and you don't know how things would have developed without that. And that was the real problem. We don't really know. We have India, for example. They were unprotected last year against the Delta version, and they had terrible, it was disastrous. Now they are lucky because they have 90% immunization, and they are very good, but the price was very high. Now I think these things should be discussed, and I simply don't know that your argument would, even if your position, I absolutely agree. We have to control the state in taking these kinds of measures. But there is also a classical liberal position, political position, that the state, it is a state task to guarantee public security, public health, and so it's not on principle false from a liberal point of view. Certain restrictions, temporary restrictions. The problem is, will they be temporary? I think they will be temporary, but they could be perhaps now be more open and more, There is a risk because the left is taking advantage from these situations to put their agenda. That's absolutely clear. But I think the argument is not yet very convincing for me.
Thank you, Father Martin. I would say I would grant that the analogy is far from perfect. My point was that we should see whether any government reaction is exaggerated or really justified. That was the point. So it's clearly not the same with the virus spreading, and having one accident with deaths. It's not the same phenomenon. But I would say there is something to be said about how to assess whether a concrete government restriction is prudent or not. For example, lockdowns. I was making the argument the entire time that there's no evidence that they actually work. So in many countries where there were severe lockdowns, the numbers were even worse than in Croatia, which had very mild restrictions. So if lockdowns work, one would expect that the numbers would significantly decrease and that the performance, let's say, in these countries would be much better than in places that were more open for business. But I think the evidence has not shown that. So the government, after last year, where they resisted a severe lockdown, this year they're more inclined to stay the course. There was again pressure on our government to introduce lockdowns, which they haven't done because of these new numbers and the Delta variant and the rising, the people who are being tested, on a daily basis. They show a steady increase over the past few weeks. The question is whether closing down businesses and daily activity is a good idea. Does it actually produce the intended consequences, the intended results? And I think the evidence shows that they don't. They certainly cause economic harm. They cause psychological harm for people who simply are not allowed or forbidden to work, to maintain their shops. I know for a brief time the schools weren't open in Croatia, so parents had to organize their day with young school children in the home. For many families, this wasn't even possible if both parents were at the time working. So it was very chaotic and stressful. Now, does the government take into account all this stress and perhaps health complications that could arise from these measures? I'm not sure. I think now they're much more inclined to keep schools open. But now the problem is they're insisting that children wear masks. I told my son, one of them is in the 5th grade, that he will not wear a mask. I do not want his childhood marked by daily, on a daily basis wearing masks. And the school, agreed. I simply told them I don't want him wearing masks when he's in the classroom. I don't want him to be distracted with this thing on his face. And they didn't. There was no pushback. They simply respected my position as a parent. So the point is, there's no perfect answer. I would say it's difficult to show a perfect analogy. I would agree with you, Father. My point was that, whether the governments, especially in places that are, there are severe lockdowns that have been in place for many, many months. Australia comes to mind. I'm shocked to see scenes from Australia, empty streets. If you dare walk outside, you have the police literally arresting or harassing you. This should shock us. This should not become something that we find, acceptable. But again, I would say I haven't seen reliable evidence showing that these severe lockdowns that last for months have yielded good results. I haven't seen that.
I think we have another raised hand in the back.
Me or somebody else? I'm Steve Baker. I'm a British Member of Parliament. Really grateful for your remarks. Can I put a question to you that I'm often asked? To what extent do you think that this pandemic has changed the attitudes of individuals to the state and to power?
Well, it's changed them significantly, and in Croatia, I find the confidence that average people have in their leaders who don't really, I think are improvising on a daily basis and don't have firm answers. They have far too much confidence in what they're being told on a daily basis. And I find that very worrisome, especially among the older population. So when you see polls on how Croatians view our health authorities, how they're performing, the numbers vary widely according to, when you follow the demographics. So people generally over 60, are happy, have confidence. They want these people on TV on a daily basis telling them, how to live their lives. People under 30 or 35 are much more critical, and they don't want to be told. So, but again, we have to look at, who are the groups at risk. As far as I know, I'm not a medical expert or an expert on COVID, but I haven't seen evidence showing that children or our fellow citizens under the age of 18 are especially at risk. And now there's talk of vaccinating children. The most calls I get as an MP are from worried parents who want this discussion about vaccinating children to disappear. They simply don't want to be pressured into doing this. And again, there is in Croatia, we have done, when you look at the EU numbers, relatively poorly when you look at the vaccination rates. So only about half of the adult population has been vaccinated. There's a lot of skepticism. A lot of people have had the disease. I contracted it last year. I feel very safe. My doctor told me that I have plenty of antibodies. So before I got in my car and came to Austria, I got tested. But unfortunately, it's turning into a major nuisance, getting tested all the time. So this is something we also have to, present as a question. Is it acceptable that healthy people need to prove that they're healthy on a regular basis? I think there's a problem with that.
Okay, unfortunately, time is up. So you can always approach Stefan in one of the coffee breaks. So thank you very much for the questions, for the attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference.